last week there was an interesting development that made me decide to change direction, at least for this Sunday, and talk about the New Testament, the reliability, the historical reliability of the New Testament. And what happened was that there was news coverage about a scroll that was found in Israel. The scroll itself was found 30 years ago, but they were able to read the scroll only now. Okay, so the reason why they were able to read the scroll only now is because the scroll was found inside a synagogue on the west bank of the Dead Sea. These are not the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves. Okay, this was found in a synagogue in the 70s, and the synagogue had pretty much burned down. So the scroll looked more like a stick because it had been compacted and crushed and burned. So it looked pretty much like a burnt stick that you'd find at the scene of a fire. So archaeologists had tried, there were other similar scrolls. They knew they were scrolls, and when they touched them, it would just fall apart. So they just let it be. Well, now they used computerized tomography, also known as a CT scan. So they took the scroll in some university in Israel and put it through a CT scan and created a 3D image of this crunched up scroll, and then used software, okay, to take the 3D image and unwrap the 3D image on the computer. I mean, this is just awesome. I love talking about this. This is better than like watching a sci-fi movie, right? This is like actually. And they were able to read the scroll. And they found chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Leviticus. Okay. And they found that the text we have today is 100% unchanged. Wow. This is the oldest fragment of the Bible discovered to date.
Really?
Yeah.
What did they date it to?
Let's see. I'm going to read what we actually have here. So, for decades, an object much like a burnt stick sat in storage in Israel, awaiting the day when its secrets could be divined. Now, researchers have revealed that the blackened object is one of the oldest known copies of a text fundamental to both Jews and Christians. Hidden within the charred manuscript are verses from the sacred text called the 5 Books of Moses. Also collectively known as the Torah, they are the foundation of Judaism and also integral to Christianity's Old Testament. To scholars' astonishment, the newly divulged text is exactly the same in both letters and format as texts in modern Torah scrolls read by most Jews now. The burnt manuscript dates to the 3rd or 4th century according to chemical dating. So that puts it at roughly, what are we thinking, 1800, 1700 years? Is that right? 3rd century, right? Whereabouts? Yeah, about 1700 years. 1600 years, maybe. 3rd or 4th.
We're in the 21st century.
We're in the 21st. Yeah. 1800 years. Yeah. So, yeah, and so this adds to the credibility of our Bible today, that what we have today is basically 100% the same as what existed back then. Because that's a claim that Jews and Christians make, and it is a claim that Muslims reject. So Muslims are always saying that the Old and New Testaments have been altered. Okay. And Christians and Jews are saying, no, the Old and New Testaments that we have are the same. So that's one of the points of conversation if you're talking to a Muslim who's educated about his or her faith. Somebody who actually has understood what the issues are about their faith and about the Christian faith. One of the issues is, has the Bible been changed? And so this shows, these sorts of things that people have found, in addition to the Dead Sea Scrolls, have shown that no, Bible has not been changed. Okay, so one of those chunks of debris, now known as the En-Gedi scroll. En-Gedi is the name of a place by the Dead Sea, and it's referred to in Kings and Chronicles, and in the Song of Solomon. You'll find this name En-Gedi, which is it was a well-known location in Israel. So one of the chunks of debris known as the En-Gedi scroll was given a high-resolution version of a CT scan. Researchers created a digital 3D model of the scroll and looked on every surface for bright spots indicating inked letters. The images were digitally flattened and then pieced together, unveiling the text of 5 complete wraps. So 5 complete wraps of the scroll were unraveled digitally. The text from the first and second chapters of Leviticus includes 20 verses in all, says the study co-author Michael Segal of Israel's Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The verses describe the proper procedure for making sacrifices. Reading in part, the Lord summoned Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel." So that's just gives you the chills.
Does it say when the synagogue was burned down? I mean, has it been burned down for centuries?
No, it doesn't. At least not what I have here. Yeah. The study's author, so they're not done unwrapping this. So this is still going on. Okay. So the study's authors say they hope to see more of the verses from the scroll. But what they have so far are just like modern paragraphs, study co-author Emmanuel Tall of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem said. This is quite amazing for us that in 2,000 years this text has not changed. So the only fragments and scrolls which are older than this are the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were not used in a synagogue. They were part of this other community called the Qumran community, and they were found in caves. And I think it was in the 50s when there was a boy with who was sort of a shepherd, and some of the goats wandered into the cave, and then he went into the cave to find the goats, and then found this big urn, and then the urn was filled with the Old Testament scrolls. So that made me think, we should pause at this juncture and talk a little bit about the reliability of the New Testament. Okay. So, yes.
What then is the source of your Bible? Where did you get that information? Where did that come from?
Oh, it's just the church copying the Bible over and over again. So you have 2 communities. So where did we get our Bible from, right? So you have the time of Christ. And from the time of Christ, you have 2 communities. You have the Jewish community and the newly formed Christian community. Okay? Both communities had professional scribes. Okay, so let's go back in our minds to the time of Christ. So Christ dies on the cross, is resurrected. The day of ascension comes, and he leaves, and then the church is born, right? The outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And now, who are the first Christians? Where are the first Christians? They're all in Jerusalem. And who are they ethnically? They're all Jewish. So it's really Jewish people in Jerusalem who believed in Jesus. Okay. Amongst them are a lot of scribes and Pharisees and priests. Okay, so who are the scribes? They are professional Bible copying people. They are human Xerox machines. Or what we call nobody knows what a Xerox machine is. But maybe we will. Yeah, well, we do. So.
No college kids.
Yeah, right? Sorry? Yeah. Yeah. So a scribe is a person who had very good handwriting. They would wake up in the morning and go through this ritual washing, and then their job was to copy the Bible from morning till evening, and that's all they did with their life. That was their job. So that's how they made. I mean, you needed somebody to make copies of the Bible, right? So this.
More the Old Testament, because we're talking about Leviticus. That's what we're.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking.
Scribes copied the Old Testament.
Right.
So think of it this way. That's why we said when the church is born, there are two parallel communities that started from one community. So you have Jews. Jesus comes, and people preach Christ. Some of the Jews become Christians. So now you have the Jews and the Christians. The Jews keep on copying the Old Testament.
Yeah,
The Jews and
she might be getting at if you start with the 5 books of Moses,
yeah.
and the earliest books, the Psalms, where did they originate from, and how did they get to the point where the scribes were copying them?
Because the scribes are always copying them. Yeah. So okay. So we'll try that. We'll try to do this, right? So where does the Bible? Where do the written documents of the Bible originate? They originate starting, not exactly, but starting in Egypt. Okay. Egypt is one of 2 places that we know for sure had paper. Okay. So Egyptians had papyrus. So the papyrus reed that would grow in the water, you cut the papyrus down, flatten it and dry it, and then Egyptians developed ink and they would write. China is the other place where they had paper. So Egypt, think about the royal palace of Egypt. There was a young man, very well educated. Okay, his name is Moses. He was educated in Egyptian wisdom and literature and mathematics and astronomy and all of this. So we know that from the book of Acts, I believe it's chapter 7, where Stephen says that Moses was educated in everything that the Egyptians had to offer. So from Egypt, you have the Exodus, and so Moses begins to write Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, the 5 books. So this Exodus, what I mean by Exodus here is not the book. I'm talking about, they all left Egypt and start going through the desert, right? So Moses starts writing the 5 books. Now from there onwards, you have to make copies. Right? There's no other way to do it. So did they know how to make copies? Did they know how to write? Those are all questions that people have finished answering. Egypt was the center of the world, right? These guys built the pyramids. They had marble, stone. They had mathematics. They had astronomy. They embalmed bodies. They had literature. Egypt was the center for food. We know this because of the Genesis narrative that says that when there was a famine in the land, God raised up Joseph, put him in power in Egypt, and Joseph took 7 years to store up grain and then sold the grain to the rest of the world because there's such bad famine all around. So Egypt is this massive, big civilization. Of course they know how to write books, and they had laws, and they had language, they had literature, they had all of that. So Moses was trained over there, comes out and starts writing 5 books. And after that, it's copies that are being made. And so now you have papyrus here, then you have scrolls, which is parchment. parchment is animal skin. So you can take animal skin and make it really thin, dry it, and then you use that to write on it. And so you have this community of people known as the scribes. Within Israel, they had scribes. And the scribes are responsible for making copies. And that's the story. After that, that part doesn't change. Just more and more books get added on as God raises up prophets and speaks through them. And some books, which are more historical books, and they all get added onto the Bible. And by the time we come to the modern era, right, we have something like 10,000 copies of the Old Testament. So you can compare all the copies to see how accurate they are. So these copies, these 10,000 copies, are their dating is scattered through the past 2,000 years. And after Israel was destroyed, so 70 AD, so this is all going to be in Hebrew, right? We're talking about the Old Testament. So this is all Hebrew. So this is the Hebrew Old Testament, and you get 39 books. So what happens is that, remember, Nebuchadnezzar attacks Jerusalem, captures Jerusalem, takes them captives, and they all go off to Babylon for 70 years. Some of them stay in Babylon, they don't come back. Okay, so you have a community in Babylon, you have most of the Israelites coming back to Israel, and then after Malachi is over, you had the intertestamental period. So you have Malachi over here. What is Malachi?
Last book of the Old Testament.
Last book of the Old Testament. Then you have 400 years. Okay? And now this is the beginning of the New Testament. The New Testament period. Okay? So in the 400 years, we have Greek influence. Because if you look at the period of time, what was happening in history is that the Greek emperors became more and more and more powerful, and the Greek language spread all over the place. The Middle East was ruled by the Greeks. So what happens is that the Hebrew Bible continues, but you also have, this is the New Testament period, so I'm just going to say New Testament era, right? But now you have a Greek Old Testament. So you have a Hebrew Old Testament, but a lot of Jews are not living in Israel. They're scattered all over in other countries. And we know that because on the day of Pentecost, when everyone was filled with the Holy Spirit and they come down from the upper room, they're all speaking in different languages, which correspond to all the languages of the Jewish people who had come for the celebration. So they were Jewish people, but they didn't speak Hebrew. They lived overseas. They lived in other countries, and they came back for the pilgrimage. Once a year, they would come for the Passover celebration. So they sounded, the only uniting language would be Greek. So this Greek Old Testament is called the Septuagint.
And is that what was found in the Qumran?
No, the Qumran is Hebrew.
Okay, and this latest scroll was Hebrew also?
It's also Hebrew. So the Septuagint is also called the LXX. If you read the notes in your Bible, if you have a study Bible and you're reading the notes, you'll sometimes come across LXX. It's talking about the Greek Bible. Why is that important? Because the New Testament was written in Greek. And when they quote the Old Testament, they use the Greek Old Testament to do their quotations. So you'll find Matthew's gospel, Matthew is quoting some prophet. Well, he can't put it in Hebrew because he's writing in Greek. So he takes the quotation from the Greek Old Testament and plops it in there as he's writing. So the point is that the Old Testament, there's no question about the reliability of the Old Testament because you have the whole Old Testament written in Greek. You have it written in Hebrew. You can compare it. And today we have, in total, we have like 10,000 copies of the Hebrew Old Testament. We also have several copies of the Greek Testament because the Jews got scattered. Remember that after the New Testament era, right? What happens after the New Testament era? It's 70 AD. And Jerusalem is destroyed. So Titus destroys Jerusalem, and the Jews, so now you're going to have two communities coming out. You've got the Jews, and you've got the Christians. Both are going to get scattered. They go literally everywhere. So now the Jews end up in Cuba, they end up in China, they end up in India, they end up wherever you go, there's Jewish people living. So they take their Bibles with them and they keep making copies until we have what we have today. And the Christians started writing the New Testament. And the New Testament takes quotations from the Greek Old Testament. Yes?
Do you know why they chose LXX, which is 70? It means,
Yeah, I'm not sure the origin of LXX. It has to do, this is the Roman numerals for 70.
I think there were
Was it in the
70
years
scholars that were doing the translation from Hebrew to Greek.
Yeah, could be. Don't know. But this was just, so getting a copy of the Greek Old Testament was possible even if you were not in Israel. You could be in some Greek city and going to the synagogue. They will have the Septuagint. They'll also have the Hebrew scrolls. If you have a traveling preacher, the traveling preacher would, if the preacher is coming from Israel, they would go to the Hebrew. But the people living locally there, many of them didn't speak Hebrew. They would use the Greek version. So there was just plenty of Old Testament to go around. Yes?
On a side note, how did the Old Testament end up with 39 books? Was there like in the New Testament where they had a council to say, okay, these are the 27, but how did they get to 39?
Yeah, so I think that question is answered only in terms of the community. So the community of, so you have the temple, you've got the temple, which is the center, right? The center of religious and political life literally was the temple. Because you didn't always have kings. Sometimes you had kings. There were large periods of times when Israel had no king. You had judges, you had foreign rulers, you didn't always have kings. But what you had was the temple. So the temple had priests. And so the temple, the priests, and so you have what's known as so you've got the priests, you've got the council. We don't hear very good things about the council because they're the ones who decided to put Jesus to death. So the council is called the Sanhedrin. Okay. And then you've got the scribes. So they're the keepers of the canon. So we don't have more insight on that. Did they have, meetings? You could reasonably surmise that they would have had meetings to decide which books were in, which books were out. And you also had once in a while, right? So these were sort of always there, right? But once in a while, God would raise up a prophet. So the prophet is the wild card, right? Because the prophet doesn't have like a...
He's self-publishing.
Yes, the prophet is self-publishing. That's right. And Oh boy, you don't want to mess with the self-publishing prophet now. But the prophet did not have a designated place like a paid position, right? The prophet was just out there, and the Holy Spirit would come upon the prophet would speak and write, and then it would end up with the temple community. And they would collect it, and they make some decision saying this is going to be part of the canon. So when Christ appears in the New Testament era, Jesus shows up. Jesus starts quoting from the books of the Bible. Because Jesus is preaching. What Bible is Jesus using when he preaches?
Septuagint.
He may be using Septuagint or the Hebrew. Because the New Testament is not written yet. So Jesus opens the scrolls and starts preaching. And so you can read the four Gospels, and you find that Jesus is referring to the Old Testament books. So by then the canon was in place, because you never find Jesus, specifying that, oh, this book is not part of the Old Testament. Like Isaiah. So today, modern scholars say that Isaiah was written by two people. That there's the first half of Isaiah was written by author 1, and then the second half was written by author 2. Jesus quotes from both these halves, and Jesus affirms that it is Isaiah who wrote them. And if Jesus knows everything because he's God, that would settle the issue for us. Right? Because we go with what Jesus says, he's quoting from this half and from that half, and he's saying Isaiah said this, and there's a quotation. Then he says later on, Isaiah said this from the second half. So in Jesus' mind, it's Isaiah said both. So Jesus gives us the Old Testament. How do you know this is the right Old Testament? Because Jesus preached from it. And when Jesus discipled his disciples, when he taught them from the Old Testament. And he used the Old Testament. And so you literally have continuity, right? So this is really important to know, because how do you know nothing was, nothing slipped through the cracks, or, how do you know that there was continuity? Yes?
Do you know where Aramaic came in?
Okay, that... Yes.
Whole new ballgame. Swing and miss.
Aramaic is about the oldest. I'm thinking Aramaic is the oldest language in the world. Okay. It's older than Hebrew because it goes back to Abraham. And it's being spoken today.
Where?
You can find Aramaic in many, many Middle Eastern Christian churches. They conduct services in Aramaic today. Yeah.
And there are a lot of beautiful Aramaic worship songs.
Oh yeah, just go to YouTube.
Yeah.
Type in Aramaic worship songs. You'll find Middle Eastern Christians singing to the Lord in Aramaic.
Yeah.
Same language as Abraham.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you really even, we don't know the language, but if you just want to know what it sounded like, go to YouTube and watch one of those worship songs.
Yeah, it's great.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So Aramaic starts even before Egypt, right? Even before Egypt, you have Babylon. Babylon is called by other names, right? So the other name for the area of Babylon is Mesopotamia. So you have Adam and Eve, right? Starting from Genesis. You come up to the flood, Noah. After Noah, you have the next major event is the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel and you have a guy called Nimrod who was the ruler at that time. So Babel, that community eventually becomes, Babel is in Mesopotamia, and it's in the Greek known as Babylon. And so the oldest city that we know about, the oldest planned, well-planned city in the whole world, is the city in which Abraham lived. Okay, and that is Ur. They spoke Aramaic back then, okay. Aramaic comes from there, so Aramaic was always there. That's why when the Exodus happens and they go into the Promised Land, they conquer Israel, right? They conquer the Promised Land, take it over, and they're there for several hundred years. Then what happens is the exile happens, right? Nebuchadnezzar comes from Babylon, attacks Jerusalem, captures Jerusalem, destroys the temple, takes them captive to Babylon. So now you have thousands and thousands of Jews living in Babylon, and when they transport them, there's a teenager and his three buddies, right? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Not their real names. Okay, their real names are Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. But when they get there, they give them new names: Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego.
Those Aramaic names then?
Those were Aramaic names, yeah. Right. So, who's living in Babylon? Daniel is living in Babylon. The book of Daniel is the only book, half of which is written in Hebrew, and half of which is written in Aramaic. So yes, part of our Bible, actually, the original language of part of the Bible is Aramaic.
Do you know which half came first, or is
yeah, it's
it
right
in the
around
middle, or?
right in the middle.
Okay.
So they preserve the Aramaic text today. So I don't know if you know this, Ibrahim. Was it the second half or the first half that's Aramaic?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. So one half is Aramaic, the other half is Hebrew, because he spoke both. He had to speak both. And the Jews learned Aramaic. They had to know Aramaic because they lived in Babylon. And Aramaic continues to be like a local language in Israel. In fact, we have reason to believe that as the humanity of Jesus goes, Jesus spoke more in Aramaic than in Hebrew. And we say that because it is a well-known fact, psychologically well-known fact, right? That if you speak several languages, the language that is closest to you, like what they call the mother tongue, that is a language in which you will revert when you're under extreme stress. So if I were to learn, Portuguese today, right? And I'm in like real pain, I'm not going to be talking in Portuguese. I'm going to revert back to my mother tongue and talk in my mother tongue. When I'm for example, when I'm dying. Or if I'm like in a hospital, right? I want to speak my language, right? Not the other language which I don't know really well, which is not really close to me. And what language does Jesus speak when he's being crucified? He's speaking in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. Okay. Even when he quotes the Bible, he's still speaking in Aramaic. So Jesus was an Aramaic speaker. Yeah.
I'm seeing here that Daniel chapter 2, verse 4 through 7:28 is written in Aramaic.
Yeah. So Aramaic continues. So there were Aramaic, the Jews knew Aramaic, the Christians knew Aramaic, and they speak Aramaic today.
I'm curious, Prem, the one that they found, the most recent, what language?
Oh, this is Hebrew. So you have to remember that, they spoke Aramaic, but they kept their libraries, their Torah. They would always keep all of that, all the religious books, they maintain it in Hebrew always. The prayers are in Hebrew. So the prayer books, we have the prayer books that they use. So then you have commentaries on the Bible, and they had all these additional laws, right? So you had the Bible, but you also had these additional laws. So there's something called the Talmud, which is like partly it's a commentary on the Bible, and partly it's additional laws. So the Talmud, all of this was kept in Hebrew and in Aramaic. In fact, the Talmud, there are two versions of the Talmud. There's a Babylonian Talmud, and there's like the Israelite Talmud, because not all the Jews came back from Babylon. Some of them continued to live there. So they had their own Talmud, and it's a slightly different Talmud. So they kept the Talmud in both languages. They kept part of the book of Daniel was in Aramaic, but the Torah, the 5 books, they keep it inside the synagogue. It's going to be the Hebrew version, but you can find a Greek version in the Septuagint.
Another quick question. If Abraham was speaking Aramaic when he went to Canaan, where did Hebrew come from? Why didn't it continue to be Aramaic?
Well, the word Hebrew is, it's interesting. It's very interesting when you start tracing the word Hebrew, it is Abraham who is first referred to as Abram the Hebrew. But he wasn't always called that. So there's, after he makes a covenant with God, he is known as Abram the Hebrew. So it seems like the word was not denoting a language at that time. It was denoting something about Abram, the fact that he made a covenant with God. So then, how does it become a language? I don't know. I don't think we were even taught that.
Were the Israelites speaking Egyptian in Egypt? I mean, they were there 400 years or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
So maybe.
Yeah. See, when you get to Canaan, you find, so generally there's a family of languages, right? Just like today, if you think about what they call the Romance languages, the Romance languages are centered around Latin, right? So you have Latin, and then you have Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, and then you've got the Germanic languages. So you'll have Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, German, right? You've got that family of languages. And if you go to Asia and closer to India, you're going to see Sanskrit. And then from Sanskrit, you're going to have Hindi, you're going to have Urdu, Punjabi, Gujarati, Oriya. I mean, there's all these branches. So it's just, think of languages as something that's always evolving, and they come in like families. So the languages we're talking about, right, would be, they're called Semitic languages. Okay, Semitic languages, right? And where do the Semitic languages come from? So you have the flood, and Noah has 3 sons. So you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Japheth, more of the European people descend from Japheth. Ham, I think the descendants of Ham are more what we would call the Africans today. Okay? And then Shem is going to be the messianic line, right? So from Shem, you're going to get Abraham. And from Abraham, you're going to get Isaac and Ishmael. And Ishmael is going to be the father of the Arabs. And Isaac is going to be the father of the Jews. So that means under the Semitic languages, you're going to put Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, and there's like more. There's Akkadian, there's Hittites, all the ites. all the various ites in the land of Canaan, the Hivites, Hittites, Jebusites, Perizzites, Amalekites, right? They all had dialects and slightly different languages, and all of that is considered Semitic languages. If you look at their scripts, you can see similarities, you can see word similarities, you can see pronunciation. Like in all of these languages, right, the word for God is pretty much going to be the same. It's El, or a variant of El. So El, Elohim, instead of El, if you go with the A sound, you're going to get Allah. Allah is not that different from El. The Hebrew, it's Elohim. In the Arabic, it's Allah. By the way, Allah is just the Arabic word for God. So there's a cultural shift here, okay? Because most people, when they hear Allah, they think it's Islam. No, Allah is an Arabic word for God. So that means that today there are Christians who are Arabs, who speak Arabic, they believe in Jesus, and when they pray to Allah, because Allah is God. Right? Allah is the word Allah means God. But culturally, normally when we hear Allah, we hear it from somebody who is a Muslim. So we think of the Islamic God when we hear the word Allah. But Allah just means God. That's all it means. So if you say the Lord's Prayer, or, well, not the Lord's Prayer, but if you have an Arabic Bible and you read the Arabic Bible, you're going to see the word Allah everywhere where you'll see the word God. So we didn't really get to our reliability.
This is fascinating. This is fascinating. You can do this all over again. This is something we all should know. This is very good.
Okay.
Thank you, Prem.
Oh, you're welcome.
This is really good.
It's very non-standard for ALG, I suppose. Well, I don't know. For our ALG, I think it's fine. So
we need to pray for the students.
Yes, we
going
do.
to college.
Yes.
And also for, is there any other prayer requests?
Right. So, Mother, why don't you come up front here? We'll put our hands on you and pray for you.